Hello and welcome everyone to this lecture on how to code signs, symptoms, and abnormal findings using our ICD-10-CM coding manual. First, let's look at the code category that these codes will be from. So any codes that are for symptoms, signs, abnormal conditions, and laboratory findings not elsewhere classified will start with the code R00 through R99. So as a coder, you will start to become familiar with what your code category is or the code chapter it belongs to by what the code starts with. So any codes starting with an R belong to chapter 18 in our ICD-10-CM coding system. Chapter 18 is symptoms, signs, and abnormal clinical and laboratory findings not elsewhere classified. If you are using the Optum code manual, you can look on page 919 in your tabular list, and this is where the tabular list starts. For this chapter, you'll see that the pages are outlined in the orange color. The coding guidelines, again, every time you start to code a new chapter, it's important to become familiar with the coding guidelines. So today we're going to go over the coding guidelines for coding signs, symptoms, and ill-defined conditions. But if you want to open up your ICD-10-CM codebook, Chapter 18 is where all of the coding guidelines are for this chapter, which is on page 19 of, again, the Optum ICD-10-CM codebook. The Chapter 18 coding guidelines are on page 19. Those of you who do have a different coding manual, that's okay. Just find your coding guidelines typically at the front of your book, and then go to the chapter-specific coding guidelines, which is Part C of our official coding guidelines. And once you find Part C, then go to Chapter 18. That's where the signs, symptoms, and ill-defined or abnormal clinical conditions are included. So let's first start by explaining what is a sign or what is a symptom. They are not the same thing, even though they're used interchangeably. So as a coder, you really need to be able to identify the difference. So a sign is an objective evidence of a disease that's observed by the clinician who is examining the patient, where a symptom is something that the patient has self-reported. One main guideline that I love to point out, because lots of new coders get this confused, is it's a general coding guideline, and it's B18. So if you look on page 6 of the Optum book, this is where the B18 guideline is. Again, if you don't have that book, that's okay. Just find Coding Guidelines section B, number 18, and it's titled Use of Signs, Symptoms, Unspecified Codes. So remember, the coding guidelines tell us if a definitive diagnosis code has not been established by the end of the encounter, it is appropriate to report the code for the sign or symptom in lieu of a definitive diagnosis. So let's say a patient comes in with abdominal pain, and the physician is not able to determine the cause of that. Then we would code the abdominal pain as our diagnosis because we do not have a definitive diagnosis. But if our patient comes in with abdominal pain and it turns out that the physician has diagnosed the patient with an appendicitis and now is going to take that patient to surgery to have an appendectomy, then we code our definitive diagnosis as an appendicitis. We do not code the abdominal pain because it is part of the appendicitis. So with that, I kind of just explained this, but we use a sign or symptom code when there's not a definitive diagnosis established. There is one exception to this rule. If you are coding as an inpatient facility coder, meaning you're working at a hospital coding inpatient charts, the inpatient coding rule is that if a definitive diagnosis is described as possible, probable, suspected, likely, rule out, not ruled out with a D. Ruled out means it didn't exist, but rule out means we're still working it up. So if the diagnosis says that possible appendicitis, possible pneumonia, likely cholecystitis, then inpatient coders can code that condition as it existed. So we would code appendicitis, cholecystitis, pneumonia. Outpatient coders or physician coders cannot code possible, probable, likely diagnoses and would have to code the sign or symptom that the patient exhibited. So another error that I see new coders make is you don't want to code a sign or symptom in addition to the diagnosis that that sign or symptom is associated with. So again, you either code the definitive diagnosis or you would code the sign or symptom if the definitive diagnosis was not established. Now, there are times when there is a sign or symptom that's not part of that diagnosis, so it's not inherent in that diagnosis. And in those cases, you would be able to code the diagnosis and the sign or symptom. But if the sign or symptom is part of that typical diagnosis or that disease process, you cannot code it. There's a great resource called the Merck Manual. If you're unsure if a sign or symptom is associated with a specific diagnosis, go to the Merck Manual, MERCK, and you can look it up. It's a free online resource. If you have access to an encoder such as 3M, the Merck Manual is located there, but it's a great resource if you're unsure about a diagnosis. Go there and see what the signs and symptoms are. But here's an example that I provided. This patient has pneumonia and lower abdominal pain. So in this example, abdominal pain has nothing to do with pneumonia, so we would code each. We would assign J18 for the pneumonia and R10.30 for the abdominal pain. Now, if this had been pneumonia with chest pain, well, your lungs are located in your chest, so it would not be uncommon for a person with pneumonia to have chest pain from the coughing and the infection. So we would not code the chest pain, but the abdominal pain is not part of pneumonia, and each would be coded separately. Okay, so the coding guideline for combination codes. ICD-10-CM includes combination codes that identify both a definitive diagnosis and common symptoms. So if the combination code is inclusive, meaning both the conditions are included, we don't have to code these separate. And I put an example up here. So if we have a type 2 diabetic with hyperglycemia, even though hyperglycemia is a symptom, it's included in that combination code. So we would code the E11.65 type 2 diabetes mellitus with hyperglycemia because it's all inclusive in the code description. We wouldn't code them separate. This only applies to combination codes. The next coding guideline is when we have a patient that has had repeated falls. There's two different instances here. We would assign code R29.6 if we're coding encounters where the patient has recently fallen and the physician is investigating the reason behind the fall, or if the patient has a history of falling, then we have Z91.81. So you can use these two codes together. We could have a patient that recently fell and has a history of falling, and we would code them both together on the same encounter. And then if they figured out the reason for the fall, we would want to code that as well. The Coma Scale, this is a coding guideline that's in this chapter, and I wanted to just point it out. Many times trauma registry coders, so coders that are working specifically in trauma registry settings, are those that collect this data. But just be aware that R40.2 is the Coma Scale, and it can be used in conjunction with traumatic brain injury, acute cerebrovascular disease, or a sequela of a cerebrovascular disease. So if you are coding a Coma Scale code, you sequence it after the diagnosis code, like a traumatic brain injury. And you can get the Coma Scale documentation from maybe the ambulance, the EMT report. It doesn't have to come from the physician. And then finally, please note that we don't use a Coma Scale on patients that we've medically induced into a coma or sedated. And next, SEERS. So we've talked about SEERS when we learned about coding infectious and parasitic diseases. But when SEERS is documented with a non-infectious condition and no subsequent infection is documented, then we code for the underlying condition, such as the injury. And then we would also code R65.10 for SEERS of non-infectious origin without acute organ dysfunction. Or if the patient did have acute organ dysfunction, it would be R65.11. Okay, that was all for the coding guidelines. And again, these are all contained in the Chapter 18 guidelines for Section C, the chapter specific guidelines. I have a couple practice cases. So our first one, this 77-year-old was discharged today after being admitted 2 days ago with acute chest pain. Our discharge diagnosis is influenza pleurisy. So I'll give you just a minute and then we're going to go over what to code. So with this patient, we would not code the chest pain because it's inherent in the influenza. And the pleurisy is just saying that because of the influenza, their pleura is inflamed, so we would not code that also. We're going to look up influenza, so go to I in your index and go to influenza, which is on page 189 for those with the Optum book. It gives us code J11.1. So then we verify that in our tabular list, which is on page 679. So if we look at that explanation, it says influenza due to unidentified influenza virus with other respiratory manifestations. So the pleurisy is included in that. We're not coding that in addition. And let's go to the second case. We have a 56-year-old admitted through the ER today with generalized abdominal pain. After workup, the physician's discharge summary states possible pancreatitis or cholecystitis. So this is a good example of where we're going to code possibles. Our patient was admitted, so we know it's an inpatient. So in this example, we're going to code the pancreatitis and the cholecystitis as they existed. We would not code abdominal pain because that's a sign or symptom. So I'll let you guys look this up, but you should get K85.90 and K81.9.